Okay, I'd like to introduce tonight's talk, which is one in the series of the LSE Works talks, which are sponsored by Sage Publications. And the speaker tonight is going to be John Reenen, who is going to speak about where his future growth is going to come from. I'll just say a few words about John before we begin his talk. So John is one of the leading economists in this country. He's currently Professor of Economics at the London School of Economics. He's the director of the largest economics research centre in the country, the Centre for Economic Performance, which does a lot of work on various questions in applied economics. So John has been professor here at the LSE since October 2003. He received a BA from Cambridge quite a long time ago. His PhD from UCL in 1993. And he's worked and published very widely in various areas of economics, including economics of innovation, labour markets, productivity. He's also got quite a lot of different experiences through his career. This has involved being a senior policy advisor to the Secretary of State for Health some time ago, and worked in many international organisations. He's been a visiting professor at the University of California at Berkeley. He's a research fellow at the Institute of Fiscal Studies. Was a professor at University College London before moving to the LSE. And he was a partner in Lexicon Limited, a company that was, I think, doing stuff about new technology, if I recall right. So anyway, so John's published extensively in various areas of economics, and as I say, he's going to talk about where his future growth is going to come from tonight. So the way the talk will be structured, John will talk for about 50 minutes. Jonathan Haskel, who's the discussant, will give a discussion for 10-15 minutes after that, and then we'll open up to the floor to questions after that. So I'll hand you over to John.
Okay, so thank you very much, Steve, for that overly kind introduction. I'm going to talk tonight about the issue which lots of people are talking about, which is growth, and where on earth is it going to come from. And I want to start off by showing you a kind of graph which looks at our experience in Britain of different recessions. So what this graph does is it plots out 5 different recessions and shows you the kind of cumulative change of national output over the course of the recession. So the blue line, if you can see it, which is current, is the current recession, or the recession hopefully we're emerging out of. And it kind of tracks what's happened. And if you follow that blue line down, you can see that the first 12 months of the recession, there was a fall of about 6.5% of our national output. That's a lot. And just to give you an idea about how big that is, if you compare that to the red line coming down, the one which says 1930s, that shows you what it was like during the Great Depression of the 1930s. And you can see that for the first 12 months of the recession after 2008, in fact, the fall of GDP was actually slightly greater than it was in the Great Depression, which you can imagine that was a pretty scary moment that we were facing during that period of 2008. Now, subsequently, as we know, there's been some recovery from that. So you can see that the blue line, our current recession, kind of troughs out after about a year, 18 months, and then starts coming out. And at the end of that line is third quarter of 2010. And by that point, you can see that we're more or less like the green line, and the green line was the 1980s, which was before the current recession, the worst recession since the 1930s. So, we're currently, in a way, as bad as it was in the 1980s, which was pretty bad. So you can see that the seriousness of the recession we've been through, the Great Recession, and that's going to frame a lot of what I'm talking about, because the question is, well, how are we now in recovery? What can we do to assure recovery? And also, what are things we'd like when we're going forward? The other two show you the other recessions, or minor recessions, in the 70s. So the context of this is that after the coalition government was elected last year, we began an austerity program, as you know, to try and rein in the size of the budget deficit. As I'll describe later on, so the austerity program is the biggest consolidation of the budget since the Second World War. That's what they do apostrophe World War II. And the Chancellor has argued that there is, that's Plan A, the austerity program. There's no need for a Plan B because the economy is on the road for recovery. We have to take this medicine in order to get through it, and Plan B would be dangerous. So one of the things of my talk is my suggestion we actually do need a Plan B, because I don't think we're out of the woods yet. The two bits of bad news we had over the last month was, first of all, the economy actually in the last quarter of 2010 actually shrank by half a percentage point, and we also got some bad news that Pfizer was closing down its research lab, which was also the creator of the well-known drug Viagra, originally developed to help people with heart palpitations, and then discovered it was a side effect, which turned into a $1 billion a year industry. So, if we look at the recent recession numbers in terms of the growth of quarterly GDP, that's another way to look at it, then you can see that it looked like, things got bad and then things were getting better, a kind of a V shape. But then at the end of 2010, growth kind of plummeted, and basically we're just hoping it's the wrong kind of snow, which caused that plummeting of GDP. The worry is that the recovery is actually faltering. So the ONS actually tell us even if you took out the effects of the bad weather, growth would be basically flat, which is not very palatable for coming out of recession. The previous quarter also looked pretty bad as well, not very good. So the concern is that we're not really out of the woods. And the risk is that instead of having a nice kind of V-shaped recovery, we could potentially be heading back into an area of very low growth. So I'm going to argue that we definitely need a Plan B as an alternative to austerity, but we also need a Plan V. So we need something which helps us get back onto that growth in the same way. In some sense, the properties of Viagra had an uplifting effect in the health arena. We need a Plan B for an uplifting effect in the British economy. And the way I think we need to get that is to rethink some of the current policies that we're involved with. I'm going to argue that many of the macroeconomic policies that we're having at the moment, the austerity program is actually going too fast, too quickly. We definitely need some era of austerity, but I think I'm going to argue that it's more severe than we need to go through. But perhaps more importantly, and this is the Plan B idea, the long-term policies we have to do are things which are going to support growth. And there are many things happening at the moment that are not supporting growth, in fact, doing the opposite. I want to kind of look at what that type of plan would be. What would be a strategy for growth, as people like Richard Lambert have been arguing that going direct to CPI in order to kind of solidify our recovery. And in the context of that, I'm going to look at some of the evidence we have from economic research. In particular, I'm going to show you that, in fact, if you look at our performance overall as a country since the mid-1990s, we actually had some improvements in terms of our overall income growth. Nevertheless, despite that improvement since the mid-1990s, there still remains a big productivity gap between Britain and other leading countries. And the two reasons for that, I'm going to argue, are to do, on the one hand, with technology, with innovation, and on the other hand, to do with bad management. And we need policies to kind of deal with both of those in order to lower the growth rate in the long run. So, technology, you might be familiar with. Management, you might say, well, does that really matter so much? And I argue, in fact, management does matter a lot. So here's pictures of three managers who you might recognise. One from the UK version of the office, one from the US version of the office, and Basil Tulsi. And I'm going to argue that these three men are critical for growth. So in terms of thinking about management, a lot of the problem that I think we have is bad management, and we have to think about ways to try and improve that. So I think these guys are actually quite important to thinking about growth. Interestingly enough, one of the areas of British comparative advantage is the export of television shows about bad managers. So that does suggest there's something interesting going on here that we need to deal with. And that journey talking through about management can take us to some rather strange places. So, you know, a lot of the research I'm going to describe has actually been going around doing the usual thing for economists that are talking to people. So it's going to take us through some pretty well-managed factories. There's a factory floor from Ericsson, through to some state-owned telecoms factories in Belarus, where everybody appears to be on some mysterious break away from the rather 1950s-looking machines, all the way through to some textile plants outside Mumbai, where we've been running some experiments looking at the effective management of productivity. Okay, so here's the outline. I'm going to first of all talk about how is the UK doing. Then I'm going to talk about why we have this productivity gap, or I think we have a productivity gap. Then talk about these two sets of policies. Plan B, the potential alternatives to our kind of short-run policies of the next 3 years, and then also the long-run, the kind of the B plan, to try and get us out of the longer run our slow growth path. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to put up, I mean this, I was kind of surprised actually when I found this out, but this shows the UK growth performance since 1997, looking at what economists think is one of the key measures of material well-being, which is GDP per capita, so output per person between 1997 and 2010, so last, including the recession years. So when you look at this, it's actually kind of interesting because in terms of kind of UK's annual average growth rates, Britain actually has done pretty well compared to many of our other major countries. We've actually had faster growth per capita than the other the US, Germany, France, or Japan. If I put Italy here, in fact Italy would be about 0.5%. So you can see that Mr. Berlusconi has been other things distracting him during this period. But even if you look at other countries that you think have been doing pretty well, like Germany and the US, the UK has actually done pretty respectively over this period. Now, GDP per capita, if you look at absolute growth, then the US would do much better. But that's partly because the US has a much higher birth rate. So the absolute size of its economy is getting a lot bigger compared to, say, Germany or the UK. But GDP per head controls the size of the population, and this is a pretty good measure to look at. Now, what underlies this? Well, you can get greater income per person in broadly two ways. One is by increasing productivity, this is the focus of my talk. The other way, of course, is by trying to get more people into work. And that, both of those have been important. There's been some improvements in the employment rate over this time, which has contributed to Britain's better performance. But of course, that's very important. But in the kind of long run, the key thing behind having sustained growth is going to be productivity. So how much, given how many inputs we have, how many hours people are working, how much investment we have, can we get more out of that in terms of productivity? So here's the productivity position. So this is kind of GDP per hour works. And this is kind of, like Paul Krugman said, in the long run, productivity growth is not the only thing which matters, but it's almost the only thing which matters for economists. And that's because in the long run, productivity growth is really going to determine the wages people have and the consumption people have. So if you look at Britain's position in terms of GDP per hour, you can see it's this is in the levels, remember, not the growth rates. But in the levels, we're kind of not too bad but not too good. But if you compare us to, say, Germany or France, we have lower productivity. Compared to the US, something like 13% lower productivity. So pretty similar to other European Union countries. So what is 13% productivity? Well, broadly speaking, it means we could all take Friday afternoon off, go down to the pub and earn the same amount of money as we currently have. So if we could increase our productivity, increase our national pie by that much, we could actually enjoy the fruits of that leisure by taking time off or by spending more money on beer or whatever you want to spend your money on. But clearly it would be a big prize if we could manage to increase or bridge that productivity gap. So we have that gap and we want to try and do something to bridge that. And that's the key thing, I think, about it. It's worth bearing in mind that there have been some improvements. So going back to the graph of overall GDP per person, now looking particularly at productivity, looking at a longer period of time when we use GDP per work now. If you thought about the UK as 100 as the base category, then we can look at how we do compared to other countries. So in 1997, this is how we compared with France, Germany, and the United States. Those lines are all above 100, so these countries are all more productive than we were in terms of GDP per worker. So, say with Germany, we were about 4% less productive than the Germans, but by 2007, we actually were more productive than Germany was in terms of GDP per worker. So that's an improvement up to becoming 70% more productive than Germany between 1997 and 2007. Compare that to France, we had about a 30% deficit with France, we've reached about 3% gap. Compared to the US, we haven't changed so much. So we haven't bridged much of that gap with the US. But it's worth bearing in mind that this was a period of time when the US had the so-called productivity miracle. This was when the US economy kind of turned around and almost doubled its rate of productivity growth. So just to manage to keep up with the US over this period was in some sense quite an achievement for the UK economy. And you might say, has everything fallen apart over the subsequent couple of years? Well, not really. I mean, you know, the picture in 2009 looks reasonably similar to what it did in 2007. I mean, the US has increased its productivity a bit, but that's mainly because the US has been very aggressive in laying workers off, and the unemployment rate increased quite significantly. So I don't think that's any particular achievement for the US. In fact, I think that's not the problem with the US. So, you know, over this period, between the mid-90s and the current period, there has been, I think, some productivity improvements in the UK economy. You know, if we went further back in time, back to 1979, then you can see that the improvements against the US, there was a bit of improvement between 1979 and 1997. Against France, there was actually deterioration. So it's not like this is simply a continuation of a long-run trend. There does appear to be some improvement. Why did that improvement take place? You know, I don't think economists know the full reasons, but I speculate there's a couple of things which are important. So one is human capital. Actually, many of the students in the room, and one of the things which the British economy was successful at doing was actually increasing the proportion of people who had college degrees over this period. So from 1997 to 2010, we had something like a 12 percentage points increase of the proportion of workers who had college degrees, something like 15% to 27%. So of course, when you get more skilled people into the labour force, this increases productivity. That's a critical thing about increasing productivity. Other things are important as well. I mean, I think another factor underlying here is increasing competition, which I'm going to talk about, and also some issues of innovation as well, which I'll mention in a second. Okay, so nevertheless, there's been some improvement, but still remains this productivity gap. So what lies beneath the productivity gap? What are the two factors? Well, the first factor I think is the one often being talked about due to innovation and technology. And I think that technological innovation is clearly one of the causes of our productivity gap in the United States. So the UK does have an innovation deficit. And the story is that we're actually in this country very strong in basic science or in elite universities. So, for example, 14% of all the top scientific papers in the world come from the UK, 1% of the population. So we're second only to the US in that regard. Nevertheless, commercialising those innovations, getting those new inventions, those new ideas into products and processes which make money is something which we're much weaker on. So if you look at our performance on patenting or research and development, we're actually not so good, or indeed productivity, I've shown you, we're not so good in trying to commercialise those innovations. So I think showing some numbers for research and development, that's not the only element of innovation that Jonathan's going to talk in more detail about. But I think it's a useful indicator. It gives you one measure of how we're doing in terms of innovation. And what you can do, if you look at how much of our GDP Britain gives to spend on research and development, I plotted those lines. You can see one thing that the UK looks relatively low compared to other countries. And I put this between the 3 years, 87, 97, and 2007. You can see that in the 80s and the early 90s, there was this kind of fall off in our R&D intensity, when most of the countries were increasing their R&D intensity. And for about the mid-2000s, that stabilised and reversed to some degree, which helped stop that long run decline. That decline started in the late 70s. So for about the mid-2000s, there has been some improvements, or at least an arrestment of that R&D decline. Nevertheless, we're still not doing as well as I think we probably could do in terms of how much we're investing in research and development. And the lag of the Pfizer thing was a particular shock, because that was clearly an R&D lab which was being closed down. Okay, so that's one aspect of innovation, and there's an issue around how we get more innovation. The second issue is around management practices, and this is much less known, so I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. So, I really think that although there is some problem with hard technologies, a bigger problem, I think, or as big a problem, is the way that firms are managed. So many technologies are available globally. So why is it that some firms, some countries, appear to actually use these technologies and get much more productivity out of them than other countries and other firms do? And information technology is a good example of this. So, all countries have some level of access to computers and information technologies, but some firms and some countries appear to get much more productivity out of it than others do. And people who looked at the US performance versus other countries have suggested that there is this interesting thing about why do Americans seem to use IT more effectively. So we think one of the reasons might well be to do with management, and in work which I've been doing with colleagues in Stanford, in Bloom and Rockefeller at Harvard, we've actually been trying really hard to really think about how do you possibly measure, quantify and compare management across firms and countries is a very, very challenging task, but we've taken it on. And the way that we try to take it on is develop a new kind of methodology. So we first of all started with a bunch of different questions about management practices which we think are associated with productivity. I can show you some examples, but mostly the big common sense kind of thing. So it's a question about how you monitor what goes on in your firm. Are you trying to continuously improve it? Are you trying to use new types of techniques? Targets, your sensible targets, or are your targets like impossible to ever reach? Or are they so easy everybody reaches them? Are they a mixture of financial and non-financial? And issues with people management, the human resources, hiring and firing, paying people, promoting people. So I'll give you some examples of that. But before I do, let me just say how we do this. So we implement this by, as I said, the radical idea of talking to people. So we call up, we started off with manufacturing plant managers from 20 countries all over the world, and actually interviewing them. We've now done this in the retail sector, and the hospital sector, and schools, and a number of other places. We started with manufacturing because it's really easy to measure productivity. So that's what we kind of did. And we developed these questions not out of thin air, but from talking to many consultancies and many industrialists about the kind of basic things they thought were important to raise productivity. So we have this kind of scorecard which we're going to score people against. The next thing is how on earth do you get people to tell you the truth? Well, we have this thing called the double-blind method, and the way we do this is the people doing the interviews don't know anything about the company's performance. They just have the name and telephone number of the company. These are companies typically of about 200 employees, not companies you've ever heard of. So that's in order to stop you, being biased if you know you're interviewing a really good company. The other way we keep it blind is that the managers who are being interviewed don't know they're being scored. So they think they're having a friendly conversation with an MBA student who's just talking about some project. In the background, these guys have spent 2 weeks being trained up at McKinsey and LSE to try and actually know how to service some of the answers. And the reason that we don't tell the managers that they're being scored is because of the well-known psychological bias that if you know you're being scored, you're going to give the answers that you think the person wants you to hear. So, for example, there's a lot of psychological evidence of that happening. There was a nice experiment where people were sent off and asked whether they would vote for a right-wing party in the US as Republicans or Democrats, and they dressed up the interviewers who said exactly the same thing with the same people. One set were dressed up in conservative business suits like this, and the other set were dressed up very scruffily, with a kind of denim jacket and long hair. And of course, the answers came back. The people who were interviewed by the guys in suits, they were the Republicans in a big majority, and when the people were interviewed by the same guy that dressed scruffily, the Democrats in the majority. And the answer is very natural. People give you the answer that you want to hear. So to avoid that, we didn't inform in advance. We got this through the Human Subjects Committee, the Ethics Committee, because it's necessary deception to get accurate answers. So, that was a struggle, but it got through, and I think it's kind of important. And then finally, how do you get firms to participate in these interviews? Well, we got official endorsement from many reputable institutions in each country, such as the Bundesbank, the Treasury, the Federal Reserve. We found different things work in different countries. So in Germany, no insult to any Germans in the audience, But the Germans are by nature quite a respectful authority. So when they got the Bundesbank faxed through the eagle crest of the Bundesbank, the German managers would immediately get on the phone or the email and be very happy to participate in the interview. So that was great. Whereas in America, if you mention you've got a letter from the government, you hear the words communist and liberal, and the phone gets slammed down and nobody speaks it. So we found that the Americans are responding a lot better to the idea of this MBA guy doing this on the project. So we had a team of about 75 MBAs who've done this. Those of you like Joe who've been taught MBAs will know what an advantage of getting MBAs to do these interviews is that they tend to be loud and assertive, and we select them from businesses that they didn't like to take no for an answer. So we got a pretty good response rate from about 45% on the quality survey, and the responses were unbiased in the sense that we could compare the responders, non-responders, and the responders were no more productive than the non-responders. So I think it was a pretty good survey in that respect. Okay, here's an example of questions. So one set of questions is around, say, promotion. So the way we scored people would be, say, we asked them a question like, if you had somebody and you were thinking about promoting them, what kind of things would you do? And based on the answer to that and the probes that we give them, we try and score them in different categories. So a bad score would be if you promoted people purely on the basis of tenure or family connections, so nothing to do with effort or ability or performance. Whereas a high score would be the firms who actually try to identify, develop, and promote those performance. So essentially taking their effort and ability into account when making decisions. So the way you get at this is not by just saying, do you have different performance? You actually say, just talk me through what we do for promotion procedures. As people talk, you can use that in order to classify what we're doing. We've also done in some of our works actually sent people out into the firms to interview workers and other parts of the other managers to corroborate this, and it seems to work pretty well. So we have this for the same type of thing for payment systems, for hiring, and other questions, what do you do with people, and so on. And the set of these 18 different questions, are all up on the website. If you look at them, go into our kind of composite measure of good bad management. So if you put that measure together, the kind of interesting thing is if you correlate that with lots of things in firm performance, these are really highly correlated with things like productivity. So this correlates this average management practice score across all 18 questions. So one is a really bad score, and one is the firms who are promoting people based on whether they're family connected or ignoring any underperformance or not monitoring what's going on. The 5 ones are really good. You can see that if you correlate that with productivity, there's a pretty strong correlation. That correlation is there in every country you've looked at. It's not just the kind of Anglo-Saxon type of countries. You see that equally in China, in Japan, in Southern Europe, in Germany, and France. So this is not a causal relationship. This is just saying that these measures that we've come up with have information. That we just complete garbage. You would expect them to be correlated with the performance that they are. So if we take our management measures, we can actually then look at some differences across countries. So here's the kind of average score across different countries of our management measure. And you can see the ranking of these countries looks similar to what you find for the ranking for activities I showed you earlier. So the US does very well. There's a kind of Premier League of countries like Germany, Sweden, and Japan. And then the UK is kind of in the middle of the pack. It's not the Premier League by any stretch of imagination, but it's kind of in the middle of the pack for similar to kind of Australia and Italy and so on. And then at the bottom of the pile of developing countries like India, Brazil, and China, Greece did particularly badly. So when we did this, most of the data in 2006, Greece did particularly badly. We thought, well, we must have done something wrong here. Greece is a European Union country, surely it can't be that bad. Last year, when people were throwing petrol bombs on the streets of Athens, we realised that in fact, maybe we were actually picking up something about what was happening in the Greek economy and society. In fact, I wish I at that point shorted the sovereign debt of Greece. Not standing here now, I'm very rich, and I've taken my research seriously. Okay, but much more interesting than what's going on between countries to me is what's happening within countries. So because we have this firm level data, we can plot this for every single country. This is every single data point in our data set. And what it's doing is it's plotting out the proportion of firms in each of the different bins. So the ones are the really bad ones, the 5s are the good ones. Most firms are in between, 3s and 4s and average. So you can see across every country there's a massive variation. So it's not like, every firm in the US is fantastic and every firm in India is terrible. There's just huge variation in every country. There's great, really bad companies in every country. The thing which kind of sticks out is that the US, one of the reasons that the US seems to get a high score is it actually has very few really, really badly managed firms. So one of the reasons that the US scores so highly is not necessarily as loads of firms up here, but the economy seems to be much more efficient at weeding out the badly managed firms. And if you compare the US to the UK, then you can see this very clearly that in the UK we have a much thicker tail, if you like, of these very bad, much more really badly managed firms. And that immediately makes you think, one of the reasons these differences is to do with competition is in this Darwinian sense, rooting out the weaker firms. It's also another good thing about talking to people is you actually learn a lot about cultural differences. So there's quite a few quotes you can see on the website from managers who talk. So this is one of my favourite ones from one of the plant managers that we spoke to. He was a British guy speaking to an Australian interviewer, and he said, "Your accent is really cute. I love the way you talk. Do you fancy meeting up near the factory?" What girl could resist meeting behind the factory? But this girl did, apparently. Sorry, but she was watching her every night for the next month. Now, things of course different in India. In India, one of the female interviewer had a similar type of issue. So the production man said, "Are you a Brahmin?" And so Brahmin is a high class in the interview. He actually sided with the point. "Why do you ask?" And the production man said, "Are you married?" "No." "Excellent, excellent." So I was looking for a bride. I must contact the firm and stuff. That was the end of the interview at that point. So culture is definitely okay, so we have this data, I think it has some information, but the question is, what causes these differences in management practice? So I said one is competition, and that turns out to be really important. Competition matters for two reasons. One, as I mentioned, it selects out really badly run firms and more likely to exit. The other is that even for the surviving firms, it seems to have an effect on forcing them or incentivizing those managers of those firms to try harder, perhaps in order to survive. So we find that competition matters both through the selection effect and also through this competitive effect. And you can show this in a few ways, but the easiest way to show this is to correlate. We ask the manager a simple question, we've done this in many ways. We ask them a question, now how many competitors do you think you face? And this plots out the course number of competitors correlated against the average management score. And you can see very clearly that the firms which actually face more competitors and more competition appear to be much better managed. So there appears to be a very strong competition effect. So that's kind of unsurprising, we would expect that, it's nice to see in the data. The second thing is that, this is the other thing which I think is really important, and we weren't expecting this. So if you think about what hurts good management, it turns out the best way to ruin a company is to give it to your eldest son. Apologies to anybody with family firms in the audience, but giving your, the family-run firms, so the firms which are owned by a family and are run by the eldest son or the eldest grandson of the founder, tended to be very, very badly run. And, there's several reasons you might think that. I mean, ownership by itself may not be such a bad thing, because if the family owned it, you might think that actually helps with better monitoring of what goes on. But management, also putting your family in charge, you might think has lots of problems. First of all the people in the world who could run your company, why might you think it's your son or your member of your family? I mean, you're actually restricting the pool of possible people that you could put there. I mean, I always draw the analogy that as bad as the English soccer team is, imagine that our selection rule was it would be the eldest grandsons of the people who won the 1965 World Cup. That would not be the ideal way to select the English soccer team. It would be even worse than it currently is, if you can believe that. The other things that may have an effect, if you know you can inherit the firm, you may work less hard at school. That's the Carnegie effect. And of course, if you're working in a firm and you're not a member of the family, you think, well, even if you're really good, I'm never going to make a top position because it's always going to be a top family. So, if you look at the data, you actually see something quite similar to that. So this just plots out the average management score by different types of ownership. And this is the kind of family owner, family CEO. And you can see the kind of the average scores there are one of the lowest in the table, going on low. The government run the lowest run firms, so the worst managed firms. But that the family-run firms are also pretty bad. And it's interesting comparing that if you have a family-owned firm, again, external CEO, that's actually pretty well managed. And in fact, if you compare, say, Britain and Germany, although both countries have lots of kind of family-owned firms and lots of middle-sized firms, the German model is typically to get an external manager in to run the firm, whereas the British model is much more to get the eldest son to run the company. And that, I think, is one of the routes. That's important. So if you actually do a comparison of the management gap between the US and the UK, three factors turn out to really explain that. One is competition, the second is the CEO selection, and the third is human capital. The other factor is actually, as you imagine, strong human capital is very important for improving management practices. Not just the managers, but also the workers. You have well-trained workers, you can actually get better quality productivity from them. Okay, so that is kind of interesting, but then you might say, well, so what? We don't really care about the management aspect. What we care about is the management improves performance, does it really improve productivity? It's correlated with productivity, but there could be many other things talking about correlation. So really, in order to really get at this kind of question of causality, does management cause high productivity, we actually run a few experiments on plants in India, outside Mumbai. So this is a kind of randomized control trial where some plants get a lot of heavy management consulting. We have some control plants who get very light consulting because we don't get the data. And then we collect data for the next 2 years comparing treatments and control. So we found that when we did this, you actually get really big improvements in management practices. Something like $200,000 a year improvements in intervention. So investments which would pay back. And just to give you an idea about the before and after, so these are some of the before pictures of what these factories look like. When Nick took the top left one, you can see that toxic chemicals are spilling out. You can scared to get too close to the barrels here to photograph them. So many of the factories were disorganised, dirty and unsafe, and one of the things that the intervention did was to try and just kind of organise them better. So there's things called the 5S initiative, very simple things like snag tagging where problems took place, so they actually can get systematically fixed, sorting out the organisation of machines on the factory floor, having kind of regular meetings with the workers and managers to try and fix problems. So kind of a lot of very basic management practice interventions. And if you compare the control firms at the top and the treatment firms, this is a measure of quality defects before and after the intervention. The guys doing the treatment, the black line, had very, very big improvements in terms of improved quality and much less quality defects. It's something like 50% fewer defects than before the intervention. So this really does suggest a strong causal factor of the intervention. Okay, so let's move on to policy. So let's first of all talk about short-run policy in terms of the current debate over austerity. So there's kind of three broad views of growth that we could think of. One is the kind of more traditional right-wing view, which is the kind of shrink state and let markets flourish, which when you think of this as Thatcherism or maybe Oswaldism perhaps, or maybe on early. And the basic idea is that if you shrink the state, then you can actually relieve that through reforms and productivity. Now, of course, that has to be countered because markets do need some intervention, competition policy at least. The traditional left-wing view has been, well, what we need is a growth plan, a kind of top-down plan. The typical problem in the NHS can be solved by lots of targets that clearly work very badly. Or the more kind of, maybe basic Keynesian approach, which is what we need is just an untargeted expansion of demand in order to get ourselves out of a recessionary position. So I'm going to argue actually for an alternative, which is you can think of this as a potential enabling state, where part of what we have to do is deal with market failures, innovation, climate change, and so on. But also it's possible maybe to stimulate, when you're thinking about stimulation programs, then do this through targeted investment, not just general increase of demand, but targeted at the long run things that we might think are important, like innovation, human capital, and infrastructure spending. So just to remind you where we are. So this was the policy under Alistair Darling, the last Labour government. So it's worth bearing in mind that the March 2010 budget was a pretty tough budget. The plan was by 2016 to 17 to essentially consolidate the budget by 5% of GDP. That was £72 billion. So that was the plan prior to the coalition being elected. a pretty tough austerity program. But after the election, the coalition, the June emergency budget, decided to actually accelerate that process and also make it tougher. So the plan brought forward the budget consolidation to 2015-16, moved it up to 7% of GDP, which is 110 billion pounds. And you can see that this is also front-loaded compared to the previous plan. So a lot more of the pain is born earlier on in this year, of course, April this year, relative to the previous budget. So this is, it's easy to look at these figures and figure out, but this is actually the toughest consolidation program since the Second World War. So a very tough period of time, which we are heading into this year and going forward. Why did the government decide to do this? Well, the reason, in some sense, is obvious, you might say, because look at government borrowing over GDP. The reduction is actually going to be the third highest in the OECD that we're facing. But, of course, the level in 2010 of government borrowing was also the third highest in the world. Only the US and Ireland had a bigger government borrowing to GDP ratio. So if you looked at the position, what happened in 2007 and 2009, government spending rose from 41% to 48%, so a huge increase in spending, you might say. Receipts fell, but only by about 1 percentage point. The deficit rose from about 2.4% of GDP to 10.4% of GDP. So something had to be done. And you might say, well, doesn't this just show that spending was completely out of control and this is what was needed to be done? Now, of course, spending was too high in 2007, and for that sake, the cycle, I think, is correct to say that there should have been a lower degree of spending or a higher degree of taxation. But the reason that spending exploded as a portion of GDP wasn't because spending went up by so much, because GDP fell by so much. As I showed you in the first graph, the collapse of GDP is what fundamentally caused the spending to GDP ratio to rise. If you decided to, well, what we're going to do is keep the 41% on a massive cutback in spending in the recession or increase the taxation, this would be extremely unwise and would have plunged us into a much deeper recession. So fundamentally, it's not so much spending out of control, it's the fall of GDP. Now, the austerity program was chosen to have about a 40% government spending to GDP ratio. That's lower than it's been the historical average since the 70s. That's clearly a choice. An alternative would be to have a higher level of taxation, so it's not inevitable. The underlying assumption behind it is that there has been, as a result of the recession, a large and permanent fall of GDP. And in some sense, this underlies a lot of the consensus we often hear that we needed to have this accelerated program because the supply side of the economy has shrunk compared to what we thought it was, our potential output has shrunk. So therefore, we need to actually, in order to adjust to that, we can't have high demand because that will just go up wage inflation. So therefore, we actually need to have a tougher consolidation program, and we haven't got much room for any relaxation of that demand. Now, I actually think, although people have said that we have a 10% fall of our potential output, we really don't know. I mean, there's undoubtedly some parts of the boom and the financial crisis which is going to fall of our potential output. But the estimates, which put it as high as 7.5 points, I think are both unknown and I'm probably overly pessimistic. I think it ignores some of the productivity improvements that I actually showed you earlier on. And in my personal view, is in fact the economy is in a degree of potential output is not as bad as many people have been assuming. And of course, if you think about the cost side, there are very serious costs of front-loading the cuts, so it clearly risks the recovery, given the state of recovery. And also, and this is something Chris Reeves, Nobel Prize winners, has talked about here, and I see a lot, it also risks scrapping a lot of human fixed capital. So an obvious example of this is long-term unemployment. So rapid spending cuts lead to much higher unemployment than you'd otherwise expect, and in particular long-term unemployment. And long-term unemployment is a particular problem because it actually means that the people who become long-term unemployed lose many of their skills, lose many of their capacities, and this is almost a permanent loss to the economy. So in this sense, a kind of very pessimistic view of UK capacity becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So because we think our capacity has dropped so much, we introduce a very harsh austerity program, creating longer-term unemployment and scrapping our human capital, physical capital. And this actually means we do end up with a much reduced supply side. So I think that the risk is by undue pessimism about the potential supply side, we actually end up with self-fulfilling prophecy. That's one of the biggest fears at the moment. Okay, on the other side of the coin, you can say, what about the benefits? Have the UK not completely unsustainable debt? Now, everybody agrees that we needed some degree of austerity, and as I showed you, that was true under the previous budget. But I think that the degree of crisis can often be exaggerated. So if you look at our debt to GDP ratio, it was high, it is high, 79% currently. But if you look at over the last 300 years, that's averaged 118%. So significant. So in fact, it's not so completely out of line with the average over the last 300 years. And my sense is that you can exaggerate the problem. We've been in the worse position than we have now. Our debt has long maturity, which means we don't need to keep refinancing it. Britain's never formally defaulted on its debt. So the idea that Britain is going rapidly the way of Greece, I think, is just false. The stronger argument is that we needed to have an austerity program in order to establish credibility and confidence, to give assurance to bond markets that the UK PLC was still in business. This is really a much harder argument to decide, because this is much more about the psychology of markets and how markets are going to react. My view on this is that the fundamentals, as I said, are that Britain wasn't in crisis. There was a debt reduction plan and a deficit reduction plan. And I think the risk that we're currently in is because we have formally committed ourselves to such a budget austerity plan, we may actually find we can't deliver that. In order to avoid an even worse outcome, we'll have to then rein back on that plan and then fail to deliver that plan. And the markets are much more likely to punish that than it would have been the case had we had a more sensible deficit reduction plan in the first place. I mean, it puts us in a very difficult position now, of course, but I think that, in retrospect, I think having a more sensible deficit reduction, and even now I think there's room for some improvements from Plan B with investment. And of course, the other benefits of accelerated growth, the voters' memory is short. So we get the pain out of the way very quickly in the electoral cycle, and then when the recovery comes later on, people forget how bad it was earlier on. So in some sense, politically, it's the attractive plan, even if it isn't the attractive plan economically. So I do think we need a plan B. The chances argue against this. The argument is, well, if we go into problems, monetary policy will come to the rescue. We can lower interest rates or do some other monetary intervention. Again, given that interest rates are so low and we have concerns about inflation, I don't really see that. I see that as in normal times, I would say yes, this is a reasonable decision to take. But I think we're not in normal times at the moment. We've actually been through one of the worst financial crises in living memory. And I think that in that case, fiscal policy is called for. And the idea that, well, if we're really trouble in order to slow down, we know finding extremely difficult. Given our rhetoric, we have this worry of extreme loss of credibility. So I think moving towards a more sensible plan now, Plan B, and having that as our backup plan would be very sensible. However, we need more than Plan B, we need a Plan V. So what is the V plan, the plan for growth? There's three things that we need. First of all is we have to think about getting external conditions right. So we admit, first of all, we don't know exactly when new growth is going to come. Getting the conditions right so we can actually generate more new ideas. And then when we get those ideas, we can actually allow companies to grow is probably the key thing. But in addition to that, we also need to think about areas of growth, sectors which are going to grow. I think we're going to give some examples of that, but universities, healthcare, business services, green technology, and so on are clearly areas of growth. And we have to then map that against where we think the UK has some comparative advantage. So don't try and strike out in areas where we think we're hopeless, but look where we have some strengths and match up those growth areas with the areas where the UK has some advantage. There are many areas, market services, academic science, like biopharmaceuticals, and creative sectors. So what are the kind of conditions that we might need for growth? So as I mentioned, the management story, product market conditions are incredibly important. So I think having a strong credible competition policy, trade policies, the planning regime often holds back grow, say outside Cambridge, it's very hard to grow to a high-tech firm because it's very hard to get planning permission. The current plans to decentralise that will actually potentially make that worse. So we have to really think about the trade-off between having more relaxed planning and greater competition, which I would support, versus other things around decentralisation. I also think there's a big win here in terms of the public sector. There's lots of opportunities to actually increase competition in the public sector to actually increase performance. The second thing is on taxation. So another key condition of taxation, less the level of taxation, but more about the structure of taxation, making it simple, making it less distortionary. An example of that is in this country we have a 100% inheritance tax exemption for family businesses. So that actually encourages, in Germany, which we have that in the US, that encourages family firms, which, as I've shown you, is a drag on our management productivity, and also not good for each generation equality. And finally, if we got rid of that with the grace of the market, so it seems there's a triple win potential there. And as an example of a policy removes a distortion and actually creates stability of the tax system, which is very much in line with the earlier review. In terms of another condition, human capital, the UK has made improvements at the higher end, it's weaker at the lower end of distribution. We have too many people with very low skills, so in terms of improving that, it's not just about getting people to universities, it's also about getting people to take apprenticeships, improve their skills at that level as well, and also make the schooling system, as Steve Machin talked about, in terms of doing something about this lower end of the skill distribution. Okay, I don't know if it's talking about financial markets. Let me talk a little bit about innovation policy and then about universities and then end. So here's an example, I think, of a good example if you think about this plan B. So universities are actually a really good example of potential growth. If you think about universities traditionally as either creating new research or training people to have degrees. But it's also a fantastic export industry. So overseas students, as many of you are here, have grown massively over time. So from about 500,000 to 3.3 million today. The growth market is estimated something like 7% a year globally by McKinsey. The UK is actually second only to the US in this market in terms of overseas students. And there's an opportunity. The US actually lost market share after 2000, particularly after September the 11th, when the visa regime was tightened up. So its share was lost, similar with Australia, again due to immigration policy. So the UK has this excellent opportunity here. And unfortunately, the current policies that we have are actually squandering many of those opportunities. So there are a huge reduction in the teaching subsidy, and also the immigration target of 100,000 has also had potentially disastrous consequences. First of all, for the types of visas for very highly skilled people, which top universities rely on, that's become extremely difficult to get. The number of so-called Tier 1 visas has fallen from 14,000 last year, only 1,000 this year in the whole of the UK. So it makes it much harder to attract local talent. And similarly for students, there is a program which enables students to work temporarily after they qualify from universities. That scheme looks like it may be removed. And this, of course, is one of the great offers that we give to students to come and study at a great university and also stay on afterwards. So in terms of global war for talent, we're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot by having these kind of immigration targets. So I think a better set of policies would be to actually have a much more liberal approach to immigration, especially for immigration of high school people, which benefits growth and also actually is going to aid inequality, reduce inequality, rather than the current semantic growth policy. So that's clearly one example of a growth industry. Another example of a policy, or general policy, like an innovation policy, to think about research and development support. It's a very good example because ideas are very promiscuous. So Jonathan gets a great idea, he talks to everybody else, that helps the idea spread, and the ideas benefit everybody, probably more than poor Jonathan or poor Steve or me. But of course, because firms know that, it means they tend to underinvest in ideas or underestimate innovation. So people have estimated find the social return for research and development is about twice as big as the private return. And also, in terms of Britain, research and development helps catch up with the leaders as well as giving great innovations. So, at the moment, a good policy towards this is to have proper subsidisation of research and development. At the moment, under Gordon Brown and under this government, there is a policy called the patent box, which subsidises intellectual property. It's going to cost us £1 billion a year, and will do nothing for research and development. It's going to just subsidise already created intellectual property. So an easy thing to do is to remove that and actually use that to actually directly subsidise the R&D system, either through tax credits or more directly through universities. So that would be a very easy win, and I think something which should be very good for long-term growth. There's also ways that you can actually use maps of distance between different firms to try and figure out where we have some strengths and where we have some weaknesses in technology and geography. Okay, so I think I'm almost out of time, so I hope I've given you some ideas. Let's go back to our current growth position. As I said, it looks more like going into a W than going into a V. So, what we want to get back is to Plan V. So, here's my suggestion to the very glum-looking Mr. Osborne here. If we could give him the Plan V through substitute some of our lots of little blue pills, we could actually improve our position away from that very low growth to higher growth, really a super V plan. So this is what I think we need. So in conclusion, I think we have a lot of knowledge now about sources of growth management. I've argued that the short run is extreme austerity for political choice knowledge is not necessary. I think these austerity is not the level we currently have. I think management information can be improved by reforms, both the competition, taxation, universities, R&D. We really need to start thinking about the Plan B. And finally, with the potential research in the audience, there's still one more minute, you do learn a lot from talking to people. So you might say it's a very trivial thing about understanding ownership in Europe, but one manager we sort of spoke to said, we are owned by the mafia. And he's nervous. I think that's the other category, although I guess they could put you down as multinational. And I don't want you to go away thinking Americans are best at everything, so apologies to Americans in the audience, but the Americans score very highly on management and productivity. Oh yeah, but weak at geography. So we asked one guy, how many production sites do we have? Well, yeah, we have one in Texas. Actually, Texas is a different country, people say. So, also staff rewards are quite different. So in America, an employee gets a slogan, he gets a TV or a company parking space. In the UK, things are of course different. So how would you persuade the top performers to say sex is a great thing? The employee buys a new girl from somewhere else. I can't do it. Different cultures, different things. Thank you very much.
So the respondent, Jonathan Haskel from Imperial College.
Thank you very much for inviting me. My name is Jonathan Haskel. I'm from Imperial College. That was a very good talk, John. Of course, it's a very difficult talk to give without, disturbing the sensibilities of people. Fortunately, I'm not Greek. And I'm not German. I am half American, though. And let me just put on the table straight away, my father owns a family business. And I'm the oldest son. So, I was terribly offended by some of this talk. But no, it was a very nice talk.
They're not listening to Imperial.
Now, there was a review in last week's paper of a debate between Will Hutton and Anatol Kaletsky. And it said these were, two great minds talking. They said, but since they agreed with each other, it was a terribly boring debate. That's what the reviewer said. So, unfortunately, the bad news is that I actually agree with a lot of what John said. So, what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to try and disagree in order to be a little bit less boring. So let me start with my first type of disagreement. John started with this sort of the people who motivated him to actually do this study, and you saw David Brent and Basil Fawlty. The people who motivate me actually to give this talk are these Harry Potter, first of all, And then just to inject a bit of glamour into the proceedings, we have Colin Firth and those co-stars. So those are the people who I sort of think about when I'm thinking about growth, for the reason that I'll just talk about in a second. But firstly, on a much less glamorous issue, which is the issue about austerity, which John talked about. Now, again, let me, for purposes of discussion, disagree, John, with you, if I may. The first point to make, I think, is it's kind of important that the political parties don't actually differ all that much on this, I think. Labour's March 2010 budget plans were to cut total spending by 2014 to 42% of GDP. The latest OBR documents about the current government suggest that it's going to be cut to around 40.4% of GDP. I mean, that is within something area of GDP. So there's really not that much difference, in my opinion, between the two political parties. I think that's kind of important to say. The second issue, John, which you touched on in your talk, was about the issue of credibility. Now, it just seems to me that this credibility is hard to pin down, but it's kind of important. I mean, even the most ardent Keynesian would argue that you want to spend in recessions, but, you have to cut when times are good. Now, since we've, in Britain, done exactly the opposite, maybe we have lots of spending when times are good, it seems to me we do face this terrible credibility problem. And part of the reason why the cuts have to be so large is that is the cost of credibility. And it's a horrible, horrible cost to bear, but I think that's an element of it. So that's the second point I make. The third point I make is that I think we got ourselves, and it's related to the credibility issue, into this terrible quandary where we had very excessive reliance on the tax take from financial services. So financial services, according to the IFS, were paying about 30% of all corporation tax payments. And once we get into that, then there is an unholy collusion between the government and between banks. That leads to the poor regulation, in my personal opinion, of banks under all the various difficulties we get. So we had to get out of that as well. Now, the last point I wanted to make, and just develop a little bit, if I may, in a couple of slides, is it's all very well talking about the level of spending, but I think it's important to figure out what we're actually spending it on. And here, as usual, the Institute for Fiscal Studies are right on the money. Here's the latest Green Budget report, and you can see the public-private wage differentials here. These are for men and women controlling for education and age and so forth. And you can see that over in the final period, up over here, there was an acceleration in public sector wage differentials. So these are for like people, public sector workers are really pulling ahead in terms of their wages. So that's one thing. The second thing the IFS has nailed down is the pensions that public sector workers are entitled to. And you can see that in the middle here, the pension rates have actually gone up, and they're quite high, and in the private sector, the value of pensions has gone down, and they're much lower. So those are rather different as well. Now, you might say, oh, well, maybe we're getting a lot for this pay premium, for this pensions premium. So let's just take a little look at public and private sector productivity. Here's private sector productivity from some work that I've been doing, kindly sponsored by Meta. The black line at the top tells you output, the purple line at the bottom tells you input. This is kind of an index of labour and capital inputs. And what you see in this is what you see in private sector productivity most of the time, namely that output goes ahead of input as the private sector gets more efficient, does more clever things with its particular inputs. Now, what's been happening in the public sector, sorry, these lines are kind of faint, but basically both of those lines in the public sector, both output and input, are going up. In fact, if anything, the input line goes up faster than the output line. And the best estimates of the ONS, and this is controlling just for quality and all the various measurement difficulties they are, is that public sector productivity has been falling by about 0.5% per year since 1997. Now, these things are really, really, really hard to measure. And I'm quite prepared to believe that these figures are not exactly right, but we are talking about a public sector which I think is in badly in need of reform. And so I think we mustn't forget that when we're thinking about how much money to spend. Let me pass then on to growth policy. And as I said, there's much to agree with in the lecture. Let me pick out a few bullet points from an earlier version of the lecture that John sent me. I guess my major thing, if I had to say kind of one thing, is that the industry split, I believe, is just mostly completely unhelpful. It's just not very helpful anymore to talk about manufacturing and services and high-value manufacturing and all that kind of thing. And let me go through just a couple of reasons why that might be the case. The first is, to slightly contradict myself, there are some cases where it is kind of helpful. So, for example, planning policy, which I think John mentioned quickly in passing, particularly impacts on retailing. So this incredibly stupid planning policy we've got, which creates all manner of environmental difficulties and so forth, is pretty bad for retailing productivity. So that's where it's quite helpful to focus on a particular industry who are particularly hurt by a particular policy. But the second bullet point says there, most industries have just been completely transformed. So I think the lines of industry are terribly fuzzy. So for example, manufacturing industry is a heavy investor in all manners of old-fashioned tangible capital, machines and computers and tables and chairs and all that kind of thing. But it is an enormous investor in design and in software and in branding and all of those intangible things which are often seen as being the domain of the service sector. So it's just a fuzzy mix between manufacturing and services. I don't think that helps us. It feeds an unhealthy obsession with manufacturing, which I don't think makes much sense, given these industries are doing different things. And I think it leads to entry barriers and capture. So that's the first thing about the industry split. A few words on R&D and Pfizer and management and those kind of issues that John said. One is a narrow point. My understanding of the Pfizer thing, which is obviously not good, is that the spend per drug is rising very sharply. And there has been some correspondence in the FT, about which I am no expert, pointing out that actually Pfizer's R&D down there was not the most productive R&D by any means, in the way they were in the tail of the R&D distribution. In the tail of the productivity distribution, the productivity of the R&D was not as good as it might be in other places. So I think there's some issues there. The more broader point, is a point with which I agree, which is that innovation is not just in R&D. It's in a large range of intangible assets, one of which, of course, is management. And if we think about that, I think it helps us think about growth and innovation and where they go together. So the view of growth I have is one founded on the notions of a broad category of intangible investments. Here are some examples here of some innovative products which show this principle. So the iPhone has R&D and patents, as it were, inside it, but it's a miracle of software, design, marketing, branding, all those different things. EasyJet, very innovative company by anybody's measure, I think. Again, no R&D and no patents, but what are they incredibly good at? Software, branding, and like other low-cost airlines, are fantastically good at business processes, which is surely where the management comes in. Likewise in financial services, there's no R&D or patenting there, but they're doing a lot of product development, spending on a ton of software, branding and training and those kind of things. And all of that leads me to say that we need to think much more, not only creatively, but we need to think much more seriously about the creative sector, who both produce these intangibles and use some of these intangibles as well. So what kind of understanding does that give us in terms of growth, which is kind of a question on the card tonight? Growth is driven then by labour quality, by tangible capital equipment, particularly computers, and then by these intangible capital inputs as well. Management is one of those, but also there are these sort of broader issues as well. All right, so what do we know about the output and the use of these intangibles? Let me just show a couple of slides, Steve, if I may, and then I'll stop. And a case study, I think, about how this stuff is important, but is sort of beneath the radar, is in movies. So this is why I wanted to talk about Harry Potter and Colin Firth. So here's the spending, according to the official data, on making movies. And so if you look at this, you see the graph kind of goes up, and that kind of looks right, and you think, well, that's okay, it's all being measured correctly and so forth. But if you look at the scale, you'll see that in 2009, let me read it out in case you can't read it, the spending here, according to the official data, is £40 million. Now, if you start to think about the movies that you know that are made here, let's go to The King's Speech. That cost £9 million. Harry Potter cost about £100 million. Sherlock Holmes, very successful movie, it was made here, down in Greenwich, and shot up in Liverpool a little bit as well. That was another £80 million. Yet somehow or other, the official measures seem to be about £40 million. And the reason for that turns out that the official measures of what is surely one of our most creative sectors and kind of headline sectors turn out to be the spending by Film 4. So The King's Speech, which was passed up by Film 4, is not in the movie spending because it's off the statistical radar, because Film 4 decided that it would be a dismal failure and they weren't going to fund it. So we need a better measure of that, and if you do a slightly better measure of that, you total up all the spend and correct for the fact that imports and exports and all that kind of thing, you get this pink number way up here around the 250, 300 million mark. So the intangible sort of sector is kind of somewhat neglected by the statistical authorities, and that needs to be the case. I'm not going to plague you with too many more numbers. Tangible spend, according to our best estimates, again this is work we've done, kindly sponsored by Nesta, is about 104 billion intangible spending is higher than that. 140 billion, business processes, training, all those kind of things. Whoops, they're very important. How did I manage to press that? I pressed the wrong button. Apologise. Let me then tell you a little bit about tangible and intangible spending on manufacturing and financial services. As I was saying before, manufacturing spending on intangibles dwarfs that on tangibles, is the red box. And intangibles is very important in financial services. So if you want to understand growth in financial services, we have to look at tangibles. Okay, last couple of slides, Steve, and then I'll stop from there. The way ahead. Let's stop obsessing about industries and rebalancing. As I said before, what is a manufacturing firm? Let's improve the measurement of intangibles. We can't make policy without some proper measures. As it says, some key areas of the economy, most notably the creative industry, are very badly mismeasured. And as I mentioned before, if we want to understand financial services and these other industries, we need to know something about intangibles. What else do we need? Various public sector reforms, which are well discussed, including national wages and that crowding out effects. And then I would broadly put some of these points here, which come back to some of John's points, a better understanding about what knowledge investment actually needs. So in the private sector, what does that need? It needs a competitive and a stable taxation regime. It needs a very stable regulation framework that doesn't appropriate sunk investments. Much intangible spending is, of course, sunk. It's very difficult to get it back. We need a regulation framework that doesn't help that. We need to do something about the cost of capital. We have to get bank reform right. Kind of a situation where firms are hoarding enormous amounts of money and not investing because they're so worried about the future of the economy and what bank reform and capital costs are going to be. Likewise, in the public sector, complementary public sector investments in the science base and in universities seem to be an obvious place in the public sector to go. As John correctly pointed out, the patent box is the most appalling waste of money, terrible idea, and there were many better things that we could spend it on. And lastly, the issue about immigration, which is an enormous issue for universities, because it's going to hurt the universities enormously. We need the free movement of labour, bringing skills and ideas, and John mentioned that. And in a way, I think it takes us back to the size of the state. I'm just not sure, in the end, that politically, having a large state does not seem to be a political equilibrium with having free immigration. So unfortunately, if that's a trade-off we need to make, since, in my opinion, we want freer immigration, we might have to have a smaller state. Okay, so let me stop at that point. Thanks again for the opportunity to make some comments.
Okay, so thanks very much, Jonathan, for those. Yes. Okay, so thanks very much for those comments. I'd be keen to hear some other people. I want to talk to, but just on a couple of things. So, I think Jonathan, as you've heard, his work is really some of the best work in the world, looking at intangible investments, intangible capital. And clearly, that's providing some of the work we need to understand what's going on about the economy, which we understand very poorly. I would say that the caveat to that is that one is that we know that it's very hard to measure intangibles. R&D is hard enough intangibles. In general, there's actually an extra step of complexity. You mentioned financial services as a good example of that. It appears to be very high intangible capital. But we know that much of that intangible capital appears to be rather illusory at one level. And the other problem with the intangible capital thing, I think, is just a question of more research, is that the key thing about policy towards intangibles is whether or not it's a market failure. So we have a lot of evidence that with the market for ideas, those ideas spill over and create a wedge between what's good for the firm, what's good for the society. It's not so clear with many of these intangibles that these are just not all completely private goods. There's no obvious reason what public policy intervention should be for many of these other intangibles. So in terms of thinking about policy, then I think it's less clear at the moment, research establishes this, whether there's any reason for policy intervention to support other types of intangibles. On the public sector point, I completely agree with that. Again, maybe it's difficult, but I do think there's many wins we could have for improving productivity in the public sector. I mentioned the competition aspects, which I think are very important. I think another thing Jonathan touched on is pay as well. I think the problem actually in the public sector is we have far too much flat is far too similar in very high cost areas, for example, like London and the South East, compared to other areas of the country where it's extremely difficult to recruit and retain high quality people. And that, I did some work that showed that seems to reflect the high death rates in many places in the South East. Finally, on the kind of austerity issue, I take the point, I think it's a good point, that the difference between the parties is often exaggerated. And I think that's very important, because the idea that the alternative to the current set of policies is doing nothing is clearly the wrong counterfactual. The right counterfactual is, I think, what the 2010 budget will be kind of the same. And so I think in that sense, the difference is not as great as people say. However, it's still the case, I think, that there are differences. So that 2 percentage points of GDP by 2015 is not, I think, in margin of error. I think the front loading of it, so it's actually an extra 1 percentage point of GDP this year, is important, especially given the fragility of the recovery. So I think it's all that people want to say, but I don't think it's at all negligible.
Okay, good, thanks. Let's take some questions from the floor. I think we should take a few and accumulate them up and then get two Johns to respond to them. Would you like to ask a question?
My name is
You say your name as well.
Matthew Season. I'd like to thank you for your speech first. Regarding the sampling of the managers across countries, do you control for the different distribution of types of firms across the country? So, if my point is going towards, in the States, are they better managers or do they have firms more conducive to better management?
There's two of them.
Thank you very much. My name is Richard. I'm interested in how you measure levels of competition in respective economies. I think John Van Reenen mentioned in one of the questionnaires you asked managers, how many competitors do you have? But one of my interests with regards to the UK is, and one of my concerns is that actually domestically, it's actually levels of competition are lower compared to, let's say, the US. And I know there's a big issue at the moment with regards to inflation, and I'm a bit concerned that Mervyn King has sort of drunk the Bernanke Kool-Aid of the structural and global deflationary trends. But I'm just curious from the UK domestic point of view is how do economists measure levels of competition within an economy?
Nico McDonald. I work in the creative industries policy area, and I also wrote a co-wrote a manifesto called Big Potatoes, the London Manifesto for Innovation. I have one question for John, which is that you didn't address a sort of macro factor, which is a kind of long-term tendency for larger firms to be less productive and more mature economies to be less productive over time. Since we have kind of broader macro factor, which I think needs addressing. And I think it was interesting that you counterposed. You sort of talked about productivity and innovation, the sort of innovation in productivity, where Jonathan talked more about innovation in creating new types of things. And I think there's an important differentiation to make between doing the thing right, which is being more productive, and doing the right thing, which is actually creating new kinds of value. Creating new kinds of value actually can address the growth issue, because actually if people have cheaper things to consume or needs are displaced by new solutions, then actually the cost of living decreases in a way. And my final question to you is, the related question is Britain antipathetic to growth in the first place? The question kind of moved because we're into sustainability and reducing consumption. Do we want growth anyway, even if you've got the solution?
Yeah.
I'm not endorsing that point of view, by the way.
Just a couple more. There's one here. Yes.
My name is Chris Clegg. I'm a private investor. I'd like to come back to the rationale for austerity and the strategy, which is what you've been talking about before instead. With respect to the rationale, I'd like to challenge the comment that you made that perhaps responding to the bond markets was somewhat irrational and excessive. One thing I can say as somebody involved in bond markets is that bond markets are highly focused on the speed limit of debt GDP, debt trajectories. and the UK and the US are both coming up very closely to the key speed limit as defined by Reinhardt and Rogoff, which is 90% debt to GDP. The second thing is really the strategy that the UK is following versus the strategy that the US is following. Clearly, the austerity path hasn't yet arrived in the US. We have seen a budget this week which is somewhat fiscally prudent, but nothing like what is being proposed in the UK. One thing I know is that in the US, up until November, the head of the President's Council of Economic Advisor, Christina Rogoff, had done work on the multiplier effect of fiscal austerity. Basically, the judgment, as I understand it, as to why the US has taken the path that it has, is that the multiplier is a very high number, above 3, of austerity. So you cut 6%, potentially the impact on GDP could be as high as 18. So I'd like to get your thoughts on the difference between the US and the UK on strategy.
Let's take one at that there, and then we'll get some responses.
Hello, my name is Nael. You mentioned that commercialization of technology innovation is weak, and you mentioned in R&D and patents, and also you mentioned that innovation is not only R&D but also a set of intangible assets like management. And my question is it possible, like, to create kind of a microeconomic environment in the UK, like, or creating a kind of venture capital attraction for example, in the United States, in California, they have very good, like, cooperation of business and science and also technological innovation. Is it possible to attract venture capital or encourage businesses to launch more venture capital in the UK? Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Back to you, John.
Okay, well, thanks for all those questions. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to answer them adequately, so I'll keep on. So the first question Matthew asked on the kind of type of firm in the US. I mean, one thing we try to do to control all that is we can control the size of the firm, the age of the firm, the industry, and all those other things, which could account for the US management gap. And it turns out not going to be those type of things. I mean, there are some of those differences between countries, but the graph I showed you, you can see the same pattern, even after there's obviously those controls. On the question on how to measure competition, it's very hard. So I showed you one crude measure. We can also think about things about openness to trade. We also try that. Measures of the more open you are to trade, the higher competition is. The profitability of the industry, that's very high, very high. One nice thing we've recently done in America, I think, is looking at the healthcare sector. So their competition is really like the number of hospitals around you might think is associated with greater competition. And you can use as a natural experiment the fact that if you're living in a marginal political constituency, your hospital will never be closed. That is one thing that's guaranteed, because the political cost of closing a hospital in a marginal constituency is very high. So you can use that fact as something which you can create an experiment with that. And when you do that, you find, again, the causal effect of competition on the land is very strong and positive. There was a kind of question on Mr. McDonald. There was a series of questions, but I think the heart of this is this kind of trade-off. So could you do things which kind of make you more efficient and productive with given such goods, but sacrificing for future growth? You're getting, say, take the example of management, you get this super management thing which makes you do something more efficiently, but you don't come up with a great idea. Google, made of how to manage, but there come up with lots of ideas. And I think, we don't know, I don't know the answer to that. My My sense, actually, is these are often complements rather than substitutes. So if I can get my firm managed particularly well and doing my ideas and research, that can actually be a very efficient way of actually producing new ideas. So we haven't found a big trade-off personally, but I know in certain companies there may be examples of that. And I think the set of institutions around innovation versus efficiency, are really important questions. Chris Clegg asked an interesting question in terms of the bond market issue. So on the multiplier effect, clearly if you thought the multiplier was big as 3, then we were in really big trouble now with austerity. I think it's likely the multiplier is lower in an open economy rather than an open economy like the UK compared to a closed economy like the US. So that is the positive side, the multiplier is a bit lower. On the negative side, people I think often underestimate the danger we're in, because the estimates are often taken assuming no one else is going through the same austerity program. So people talk about Canada or Sweden growing out of the problems with the austerity programs, they forget that those times other economies were not also having austerity programs. Whereas now we're in a situation where many countries are kind of coordinating on having austerity programs, and monetary policy is not very strong. So that I think makes the effects, the multiplier effect, in the direction. So I'm pretty worried. I do think you're right to say, I'm not at all saying we should not be at all concerned with debt to GDP ratios. I do think that the US situation is a bad one, where they're not seriously taking the problem of debt enough. But as Jonathan said, I think the counterfactual is not doing the US versus doing the Oswald. It's kind of doing the Oswald versus doing the alternative, which is the alternative. So that's the kind of counterfactual I would. But I think in terms of that judgment, I'm more on the side of a slightly slower path.
Just on the US, the point that I'm really getting to is that in the US, basically the expectations from the street this year are for high 3% GDP. So Goldman Sachs last week came out and said 3.6, potentially a 4 handle on GDP. That is the strategy. So debt to GDP is a ratio. In the UK, they decided to cut the debt. In the US, they decided to grow the GDP. That's the difference.
But I think if you look over the longer run, we look at the kind of the CBO's forecast of where things will go, unless a more serious deficit reduction in place of the US, there will be an increase in debt to GDP ratio because in the medium run it's going to be well rather less. There is some action.
It's getting late in the day, so I'll just be very quick. I think questions about venture capital and innovation and things like that, we need to better understand the innovation process. In my opinion, that's type around things like intangibles and so forth. We don't really understand very well innovation in innovation itself, and the extent to which scientists can use that. On the question about multiplier, it seems to me that where you have a situation like we do with centralised wages and pensions, the multiplier effect is just very, very different. Finally, the question at the back, the gentleman asked about measuring competition. So I should declare an interest. I've just spent 8 years on the Competition Commission arguing with British Airports Authority about their airports. And how you measure competition is you employ me at a very high consultancy rate, and I'll help you out.
On that note, I think we should conclude. I'd like to thank you for coming to obviously very good lecture as part of the LSE works series. And if we just back to Steve as usual.